Hey, in this screencast, I want to talk to you about what I think is a very cool ecological principle called competitive exclusion. So in ecology, the idea of competitive exclusion basically says this: that you can't have two organisms occupy the same niche in the same way and have them both survive, because what will happen is one of them will always be slightly better adapted to accessing that food resource, and as a consequence of that, the one that's better adapted, its numbers will stay strong and grow, but the ones that's less adapted, it will end up losing out and eventually just going extinct. By extinct, I don't mean like it doesn't exist in the world; it just means it doesn't exist in that particular environment. So in college classes, it's pretty common to do this experiment. We take these two protozoans, P. aurelia and P. caudata, and we'll grow them separately in the exact same medium, but in different dishes side by side, and we'll count their numbers. And what we see is they both grow quite fine. They're both well adapted to eating this particular food resource. But now I'll take another dish that has the exact same food resource, and I'll put both species in it. And what I find is every time P. aurelia will outcompete and will grow in numbers, whereas P. caudatum will shrink in numbers and end up going extinct in that dish because it's just not quite as well adapted to accessing the resource as P. aurelia is. So this is called competitive exclusion. We see it all the time in nature. That's why niches are so specific to individual organisms. So imagine we try this. We take two different mouse species, say 100 of each, and we take them to a laboratory environment that we've constructed, and we release them. And what we find is they're both adapted to basically eating the exact same kind of food the same kind of way. Well, it turns out one of them is just by happenstance going to be a little bit better adapted to accessing that food resource. And so its numbers will grow. The other one, it can eat it, it just doesn't, it's just not as well adapted. So what happens is it gets outcompeted, and so it will end up starving to death and then going extinct. This is competitive exclusion. What we find is when we find natural environments, we tend to find one inhabitant of every niche, not two. Now, there's another thing called resource partitioning, but we're not going to worry about that. Okay, so islands, which we're going to be talking about in class today, they're a great example of this. Okay, so in an island, the idea is like when an island forms, there's all the niches are unoccupied, and so they can be filled. So let's just look at this islands as a natural laboratory. Okay, so let's just say over the course of hundreds of millions of years on the mainland, like on the continent, we have this particular gray dot represents nut trees. These nuts have evolved over hundreds of millions of years, and these blue dots represent birds that have evolved along with it, and they're specialized to eat this particular nut. They are adapted to fill the niche of eating the nuts that grow on this. The mainland birds in blue are adapted to eating the mainland nuts that grow on the trees that are shown in gray. Now, let's just say, though, what happens is these nut trees, their nuts end up drifting across the ocean and colonizing these islands offshore. Well, over time, what's going to happen is the descendants of these trees will evolve to be better adapted to living on that island just through natural selection. So over time, say a few million years, they're now a different species. We'll show them in brown because they're an island nut species. They're related but not the same. Now, if at that point the blue bird flew over to this island and tried to occupy it, it would find that it's not quite as well adapted, but as long as there's no competitors, it can eat them, and over time it will also evolve to be better at eating these nuts so that it too will become a new species. So islands are these great species incubators. Okay. Now let's just go forward in time a little bit. Okay. Now here's what we find is these birds are now adapted. So I've shown them in pink. They're not the same bird anymore. They're a slightly different species than from their ancestors that were shown in blue. So the descendants of these birds are now a different species that are well adapted to eating the island nuts. That's how natural selection works. But watch what happens. If one of these bluebirds comes over to this island now, what's going to happen? Well, it's not quite as well adapted. When there was no competitors, it did fine, but now it has to compete against birds that are already adapted to eating these nut trees. It's going to go extinct on that island. On the other hand, if it flew to this island, it would be fine because there's no competitive exclusion here. It could survive here, and eventually it would adapt to be able to eat these. So that is a pretty cool concept, you have to admit. Competitive exclusion rocks. See you guys.